Hey everyone, Cassie Draws here and welcome to today's Covey exclusive video. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to paint a German Shepherd portrait, but before we get started I just want to give a big shout out to Chartpak, Grumbacher, and Molotow who sponsor my content here on Ko-fi, YouTube, and on Twitch. Thank you so much for your support and let's go ahead and get started. So first up, I want to share with you the list of the colors that I'll be using for today's portrait, as well as I want to show you the list of brushes that I'm going to be using as well. Keep in mind you can exchange these for any products you prefer, mix these colors yourself, or use any variation of brush size and shape. So the first step in our German Shepherd painting is to get our sketch down onto our canvas. So I'd like you to take a moment now and get your German Shepherd sketched out before we start going ahead with the painting. You can use the grid method, you can use a light table, projector, you can use your freehand, whatever you prefer and however you as an artist love to sketch or to draw. Go ahead and get that preliminary outline done now. When you have it completed and you're feeling good about the sketch, you feel like it's a good solid base to work from, we can go ahead now and start working on the very important base preliminary layers. And the reason why I always block in these areas first is that no matter what I put on top of this painting, the preliminary base wash, if you will, these areas will not get lost. I've had countless paintings where accidentally I've kind of covered over my sketch of where the eyes should be, and trying to get those back in on top anatomically correct where they should be is very difficult. So what I'd like you to do is use a small brush that you have available and mix a color of Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. And we're just going to go ahead and very slowly, you can see that I'm being very dainty with this. I'm just going over top of that sort of initial eye outline. So the rubbery part of this German Shepherd's eyes, which we will really put in some more color and highlight later on. But initially this really kind of round oval type outline, I just want you to fill that in now and get those eyes blocked in. A little side note for this part of the painting as well, I would definitely mix a little bit more of this outline color as we're going to need it now for doing the nose as well. So it's probably best to have a little bit more mixed together so you don't run out halfway through. So I'm doing the same techniques, the same color mixture, Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. And I'm just gonna go ahead and fill in the inside of the nose as well as the kind of area surrounding it. So all of those kind of big markers or guidelines, I'm going to block in with this color. And the reason why I get a lot of questions about the nose and why I do this, and I can understand the eyes, that kind of being our first step, but the nose, I mean, we could have done that way later. The reason why I do it at this stage is so that if I end up over layering, I lose my sketch and I lose where I'm at. This gives me a really good indication of the distance between the eyes and the nose. So I don't make the nose too long. I don't make it a little bit shorter. All of a sudden, this German Shepherd is looking like a pug. We don't want that. We want to make sure that we have the distance correct and that it stays accurate to our photo reference. So once you have a good outline, what I like to do is I like to just kind of finalize these lines a little bit further. You'll see me kind of go back to the eyes, make sure that they're really opaque. They are fully colored in. So just look at your eyes, look at your nose guidelines, make sure that they are nice and opaque, they are nice and crisp, clean, and the way you want them to look. And then we can go ahead and start getting into the messy fun part. So the next step in our painting together is to go ahead and start working on the preliminary base layer that will indicate where the markings are or the shadows on this German Shepherd painting. So I'm taking a medium filbert brush. You can use round, square, whatever you prefer. And I'm taking my original color that we made, Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. And I've just added a little bit of extra white to it. So it is a step lighter than that initial eye outline that we have. And I'm just going in and I'm slowly start to block in where these shadows are and these sort of beautiful face markings are on this German Shepherd. And you can see that I'm being very rough with this. I am just going in and you can see I'm actually painting quite slow. So I'm really trying to digest this reference and really get the accuracy of these markings in right away. My brush is a little bit on the drier side. It's not too wet. I want this to be really just honestly like I'm drawing with paint. And this gives me a really good indicator of later on when we start working on fur details where I need to keep these darker areas so I don't go too light and kind of lose the realism and likeness to the reference photo that I am using. So my biggest piece of advice at this stage in your painting, don't worry if it looks like a hot mess at this point. They always look really kind of ugly. I hate that word, but they do. They look awkward. They look very, very unfinished. So a lot of times I see artists struggling at this stage saying, it looks horrible. I should be working on my layers and this doesn't look like fur. We are going to get to that. Purely at this stage, look at your reference. And again, every German Shepherd marking is different. So if you're following this with the intent of, doing your own German Shepherd painting, really keep a lookout of where those eye markings are. Do they have more black fur than brown? Maybe your reference is going to have a lot more dark space than mine will. This German Shepherd is very, very tan. So I only had to do a select area and a select amount. But no matter what your German Shepherd looks like, we're just going to take this color in, follow our reference, and really, really start to just, you can see here I'm adding a lot to the muzzle. We're just going to slowly start to give us a really good guideline to work from. And that's our goal. So, a little tip and trick that I'm trying to implement in my own work as well, but I thought I would mention is, for example, in a painting like this, where we are using a lot of Mars black, burnt umber, and white, that initial color mixture, we need a lot of that to go around the entire canvas. And let's be real, sometimes color mixing can be a pain in the butt. We don't want to have to keep matching this color, mixing it perfectly. It can be such a pain, especially when you just want to get these initial layers done. So something that I'm trying to remember to use in my own work is actually mixing white. And Grumbacher has a tube of mixing white paint. And basically what it does is you will add it to your color mixture and it increases the volume of this paint that you've mixed onto your palette. So it doesn't change the properties of the paint at all or the color. It just increases the amount of paint that you have to use. And so this works perfectly for these areas where the paint doesn't have to be perfectly mixed. It doesn't have to be exactly opaque. It's just a nice guideline. So by adding mixing white, there are different mediums out there for acrylic as well. If you want to work a little bit slower, there are slow drying mediums, things to bulk up your paint as well. So keep that in mind if you are struggling a little bit and don't want to have to keep mixing these colors. Those are also options for you. Now, also something that I get asked a lot, which kind of falls into that discussion as well, is adding water to your acrylic. There was a video that was released on YouTube a couple years ago, and I personally have not seen it, but I know of artists on YouTube who have talked about this video at length, where there was someone actually spreading misinformation about using water with acrylic. So essentially, they kind of scared artists away from using water with their paints, thinking that it might change the integrity of it, it might lessen the potency of the acrylic, it may fade or yellow in the future, all of these kinds of things. And realistically, that is just not true. Using water with your acrylic can be a wonderful thing, whether it's for a base layer like we're doing now, or for a glaze later on when we are working on fur. Do not be afraid to use water with your acrylic paint. It can make your paint go further. You can get more out of it. And especially for what we're doing now, it really does help create these kind of base layers and just looks really quite nice. So don't ever be afraid if you're kind of concerned. You maybe heard some things, some rumors about water. Don't be scared. I'm going to show you guys in just a few seconds here that using water can make a really, really nice base layer, and don't be afraid to use it in your own work. So using our wash and our water technique, we're going to take the same outline color that we used in the very beginning, and we're going to add a lot of water to this now. So you can see on my palette paper that it is very wet. It is beading on this palette paper. So really don't be afraid to get a little messy here. But the purpose of this layer is to do almost like a secondary shadow layer, if you will. But I don't want it to be as stark and as contrast as the first. And the reason being is because on this particular reference for this client, their dog had 3 colors initially that I needed to think about. One was that really dark sort of outline black brown color that we used. The second was this lighter gray wash color where the areas of the fur are a little bit more washed out and it has more color mixtures involved. And then of course the tan color that I will put on top as well. So you can see that I'm holding my brush very loosely. I'm following the sort of outlines of things. For example, the teeth here in the mouth area. I've blocked in a little bit of the folds of the fur, and then I'm going to add in some more details down under the mouth for where there is a large shadow. So I'm taking a look at my reference, and at this point, I am only looking at the areas of shadow that I can see. Now, you may be thinking, well, the shadow that I see is brown, and that is totally fine. We can go over top with a glaze later when we get to the fur and actually change this color. But this is just essentially a guideline. Pretend we're working almost in black and white at this point, just to give you a really good idea of where things are located on your painting. Now, you guys know me in typical Cassie fashion. I have been blabbing here while I'm starting to get working on the background. And I try to keep these videos as honest and true as possible. So this actually happened while I was recording where I was like, oh my God. But what I'm doing now is I am taking a large sort of square brush. I do have a large filbert as well that I will use. And I'm just going to slowly start to block in the background around this subject. And the reason why I'm doing this now is because I know the next step in my painting is to slowly start to work on the fur elements. And some of these fur elements actually layer on top of this background, like whiskers or kind of like those eyebrow hairs that extend beyond the painting. So I want to make sure that those are going on top of an already completed dried background. Now I'm cutting in this image. I'm taking a fully loaded brush. You can choose whatever color you prefer, but I did have a request from this client to use a sort of gray blue ombre type color. So I'm cutting in this subject. You can see I'm dragging my brush very slowly. This is very loaded up with paint. The bristles are full and I'm just going in, not worrying about being perfect, but just filling in this base layer. So if you choose to follow my painting, this background color is phthalo blue, Mars black, and white together to taste. So you may want to be a little bit more on the gray side, so you're going to use less blue. Or if you want it to be more on the blue side, you're just going to continue to add that phthalo blue to your mixture until you have the color combination that you're looking for. Now, what I like to do for my pet portraits especially, I'm not sure why, but I love the way that this looks, is towards the top of the painting with my mixture, I add in a lot more white. And so this kind of creates a nice cloudy, ombre sort of misty effect. And then towards the bottom, I will go ahead and add a little bit more Mars black and a little bit more phthalo blue. So it kind of gradiates from a lighter color towards the top. And as we go towards the bottom of the canvas, it is much darker and kind of makes it look a little bit more, I hate the word, I don't think moody really works well for it, but it's kind of the vibe that I get, that it's just a little bit more, maybe dynamic is a better word for it. It looks a little bit more dynamic and more visually appealing than just a straight base solid background. Now, of course, if you're doing this portrait for someone else and a client requests that they have a perfectly solid background, obviously you're going to, continue to work the way that your client wants you to create. However, if they give you a little bit more free reign, then try this ombre effect, try this gradient, and let me know how you feel about it. And if it was easy, or if you'd like me to cover a video on it, I can definitely do that as well. But just keep in mind, you're going to continue to change this color up a little bit at a time, add a little bit more dark color or a little bit light, depending on where you are on the canvas. And don't forget, I always do this too, but don't forget to paint the sides of the canvas as well. You can kind of see here that I'm doing that right now with this gray color. Painting the sides of the canvas just puts a nice bow on a finished painting so that even if someone doesn't frame your painting, the sides of the canvas are completed and it's not just white space. So keep that in mind. So the next step in our painting together, you're going to want to grab a medium-sized brush. So I'm using my medium filbert, and I'm just going to go ahead and start blocking in the main colors of this German Shepherd. So how I basically get started is I look at my reference and I try to find beneath all of the texture and color changes, a really good base color to start with. So I came up with this color, yellow, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and white together, and I've added about 50% water to this mixture. So it is not quite a glaze, where a glaze is very thin. You need a few different layers to get the achieved look. It definitely still has a lot of paint pigment in it, but it is not as thick or as opaque as acrylic normally is. So you can see as I'm going over top of these dark shadowed areas that those shadows still shine through, even though I'm coloring over top of them. So keep that in mind with your own portrait. At this point, you want to look at your reference and try to find that middle ground. So try not to go too light or try not to go too dark. You want to kind of find right in the middle, kind of like the sweet spot. You want to find just enough of a color that you can work with and add highlights and shadows to it as well. So while you're working on your first base layer, keep in mind that there may be some slight color variations and color changes throughout this base layer. So I noticed in my reference after I got all of this sort of beautiful tan ivory color down was that there were some areas that had a little bit more of a coppery feel to it. So I definitely knew that I needed to add in some burnt sienna to that original color. And you can just see that I'm lightly washing this in over top of that yellow layer, as well as adding in some Mars Black and burnt umber to it as well to create more of a gray variation as well. So keep in mind that with your reference, really look and digest of where these color changes happen and just lightly add that in on top of your yellow layer that you've already completed. And you can see from afar in this top down view that even just adding in this slight variation, it is very, very light, maybe 10% of a color change. It really does make a big difference and really starts to round out the 3D effect that we're looking for when we make our pet portraits. So while those layers are drying, we can go ahead now and start working on the eyes of our subject, which if you've watched my videos before, you will know that these, in my opinion, are the most important aspect of any painting. So if you're going to spend a lot of time working on something, I definitely recommend taking your time and working through these eyes in many different layers. So to get started, I'm just using my small round brush and burnt sienna as my base layer. Now, this particular German Shepherd's eyes are very sort of coppery. They're red, almost like a pottery type color. So burnt sienna was a perfect choice for me. However, your German Shepherd may have different colored eyes. So maybe they're a little bit more on the burnt umber side or the golden side. All of the eyes are so incredibly unique. So keep that in mind that this color might not work for you. You may have to change and kind of alter this tutorial to fit. So you're going to apply the same techniques and the same process, but just adjusting those colors as we go. Now you can see here that I'm slowly starting to add in the shadow details. Now the eyes for me usually take 6, 7 layers to get the achieved sort of look that I'm going for. So I'm adding in more burnt sienna and burnt umber now to create this really beautiful sort of shadow color. And every subject that I've painted through my career of wildlife and pets, most of them have always had this dark shadow along the top. So you can see that I'm putting a lot of this darker color towards the top of the eye, throughout the center, just by the pupil, and then on the edges. So you can see that I'm kind of leaving part of this lighter wash color underneath. We're going to glaze on that in a minute here, but I'm just leaving that open. And you can see by doing that and just adding in, this is only layer 1 and 2 of our shadow, you can definitely see the shape already starting to take place within these eyes. So while your first and second layers are drying, what I'd like for us to do now, before we go any further with the details, is I'd like us to revisit this initial eye outline and kind of tidy it up a little bit. So I know with my paintings, especially when I'm using a larger brush and I'm working those initial base layers, I'm not really focused on, oops, I covered over that, or oops, I shouldn't paint there. So I know mine had a lot of kind of this tan beige color over top of it. So I just wanted to go in and tidy that up a little bit. And you can see already by just adding in the Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together once more, this eye pops right off the canvas. And once this eye is completed, that's exactly what we want to happen. We want the focal point to be on these beautiful German Shepherd eyes. So tidy that up a little bit. And when you've got the outline looking fresh and clean, we can go ahead and take burnt umber and a little bit of Mars Black and start really working in some more of these shadows towards the top. And I always try to add a little bit of water and blend it into around the pupil and really just follow the shape of this eye. So an important step of this German Shepherd eye is to really get these lighter areas to pop off of the canvas. Now, if you've worked with acrylic before, you will know that a lot of times burnt sienna can be a very translucent color to work with. Same with yellow. It is very hard to layer these colors appropriately and get them to pop as much as you want them to or that you see in your mind. So a way to go about doing this is to actually take pure titanium white paint, your small round brush, and we're just going to go in and slowly start to block in the areas of this bright yellow, sort of orange, burnt sienna, highlighted part of the eye in with white first. So essentially, we are creating this really nice base layer to work from and to layer those paints over top. All right, so once your base layer has dried, and I can't stress this enough, please make sure that that white initial base layer is completely dry before tackling this step. Otherwise, you'll just end up mixing these colors together and you'll get kind of this really milky sort of yellow orange color. So once that's dry, we can go ahead now and add in our burnt sienna and our yellow together. That was the color combination that I chose for this area in the painting. And I've added a little bit of water to my small round brush, and I'm just going in layer by layer and just adding in a light glaze over top. Now you can see comparison to this right eye when I move my hand away, you can really see the difference by just adding in those tiny little layers of glazes, that it really makes this eye not only look much more round, but just much more realistic in general. You can see this really soft, nice gradient. It kind of rolls from the dark color into that light color and really just makes it pop. So again, you can do as many glaze layers as you want. That is entirely personal preference. You can come in really strong right away, or if you're a little bit more, sometimes I get a little bit intimidated, we can take it layer by layer. It does not matter. You can layer this as many times as you wish. All right, so once that part of your painting has dried and you're happy with how your eye looks so far, we can go ahead now and add what I believe is the most important part of any painting, whether it is a pet, a wild animal, a human portrait. The catchlight is responsible for bringing the life and character to your portrait. So it is very important to take this step by step. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my small round brush and I've mixed about 3 different colors or variations of a cool gray color. So I'm using titanium white, a touch of Mars black, and a touch of phthalo blue to create this really light, cool gray. And what I've done is I've just blocked in this sort of half sphere on the top of the eye. So that is where the reflection is in my reference. And you can see that I'm coming in with a darker gray on some of the edges to blend it out. I'm trying to avoid using just titanium white for this catchlight. I wanted to have different tones, different variations of color. It just bumps up the realism and it doesn't look like, for the lack of better words, a white blob as your catchlight. It has much more definition and glossiness to it. So I definitely encourage you have a few of these different cool gray tones mixed already. One a little bit darker, one a little bit more on the titanium white side for your ultimate highlight, but just kind of play around. You can see that I'm adding a lot of different tones here. I'm coming in with a much lighter color on some of the bottom edges, a sort of mid-tone, and then a darker color on the far left side as well. And you can see here, just by these layers already, this eye has really, really increased in its realistic characteristics. And of course, the shape of it as well looks like it's an eyeball sitting in a eye socket. So keep that in mind. A lot of different layering. You may want to add in some glazes over top as well if you feel you've gone too light with this color. You can always tone it down by doing a little bit of a darker Mars black glaze and just have fun with this. This is where you hopefully will start to feel really confident about the eyeball that you've painted so far. And of course, the realism, you're on the right track in your painting. So now comes the stressful part, maybe for some, the fun part for others. But I know for me, this is always the most intimidating part, is starting to work on the fur details surrounding this eye that we've painted. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my medium filbert brush and I've just made a color combination of titanium white, yellow, burnt sienna, and burnt umber together. And I'm just going in and I'm slowly starting to block in a secondary layer on top of my base. Now you can see that for this second layer, I've removed a lot of this yellow color. So I'm kind of straying away a little bit from this golden color and moving more into a beige. And the reason being is because I don't want all of this portrait to have this sort of yellow glow to it. I'm going to leave some of this sort of, I'm going to call it yellow for lack of better words, but I don't want this yellow color to be the main color of the portrait. I only want this to be in certain areas. So you can see that I'm adding in a lot of burnt umber to take this more to the brown gray side, and then using some of this really light tan color for these highlights. And at this point in the painting, it is all about layering. I'm really working to build a great foundation before I start to work on the finer details. And that is the one thing that I can say through my time of working through pet portraits and wildlife artwork is at this point in the painting, although it may be very difficult to, really try to avoid fine details at this part in the painting. I used to, and I still do call it this, I used to noodle a lot in my paintings, and I would get so stuck in one area that I would forget about the rest of the painting. The one area surrounding the eye would look perfect, and the rest of it was kind of neglected. So I'm really, really trying hard to use a bigger brush. I am not getting caught up in the fine details surrounding the eye. We're going to get to that in a second. But at this point, use your big chunky brush and just build up those second layers and give yourself a really nice foundation to work from. The next step in our painting together is to work on the shadows and the fur details around this eye now. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my small round brush and I'm making a color combination of Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. And I have about 3 different variations of this color mixed on my palette that I've added a lot of white to. So I have 3 different lightnesses of this color. And the reason being is because there are some light color shifts within these sort of fur patterns and markings surrounding this eye. So you can see there that I've added a much lighter color, whereas the eyebrow area is very, very dark. So by having those pre-mixed, I can go in and just really create a nice wet on wet technique and blend these colors together and make them look really quite seamless. So I definitely do recommend, instead of mixing these colors one at a time, you have 2 or 3 clumps or piles of these colors on your palette ready to go, and we can just continue working these markings in. And I am just doing light little flicks. I am still really looking at my reference and blocking in where these dark areas happen. I'm following that initial base shadow layer that we put in at the very beginning of our painting and just kind of starting to finalize the position of it on our painting. Because we've had so many layers on over top, it is kind of covered over. So you can see I'm kind of taking a break and pausing, looking at my reference where these dark areas are, and then plotting them in with some really light paint flicks, just flicking my wrist, creating nice short kind of stubbly hairs in and around this eye. So the next step in our painting together, what I'd like to do is I would like to take our medium-sized filbert brush and I would like to go ahead and in and around the eye area on the left-hand side, I would just like to fill in a lot of the darker colors and textures that we see in our reference. So I noticed with my painting up until this point, I was being very, very noodly with it. I was just working in a small area and I said to myself, okay, I know there's a lot more changes happening here. It would be much easier to use a larger brush, get those chunky areas down, and then worry about the fine details later. So really, I wasn't following my own darn advice that I'd include in all of my videos. I was doing the exact opposite of what I tell you guys to do in your own paintings. So here I am, I'm just taking a darker sort of burnt umber yellow color, and I'm just slowly starting to block in some of these color changes. Now you'll notice with this particular dog breed, and although it looks gorgeous at the end of the painting, getting the result that you're hoping for and kind of looking for is very difficult. There's a lot of different color shifts. There's more yellow areas, more burnt sienna areas, and maybe some darker umber gray areas. So keep that in mind as you're going. A lot of times what I find to be effective is just adding a little bit of a color change in every brush stroke. Eventually, I'd love to have a palette cam is what I'm calling it, where you guys can see me mixing my colors as I'm going ahead and painting. I think it would be helpful. But for now, just imagine that every time my hand leaves the canvas with my paintbrush, I am adding a different variation shade to my color. For example, I may be dunking into a little bit of burnt sienna. The next time that I'm dunking into my paint, I might be going to a little bit more of a burnt umber, adding some white. So keep that in mind and just have these really subtle shifts all throughout your sort of base layers of your painting. It will really help create a nice realistic portrait later on. Now that your second and your third layers are dry, we can go ahead now and start working on some of the finer details and just clean up this area a little bit of the painting. Now, I always like to say a little disclaimer that the way that I paint is not the way to go about it for everyone. There are so many different ways of painting and navigating a painting and your style. So just keep that in mind that all of these tips and tricks, hopefully you will find helpful. But if you are doing something a completely different way, please feel free to continue doing that. If it works for you, by all means, use the tools and the experiences that you have gained and use them in your own paintings. However, if you do find that you're getting lost within your painting, if you cannot seem to get where the shadow and the highlights are, maybe the fur is giving you a hard time, the biggest piece of advice, and that I still tell myself almost 4 or 5 years later, is to work from your shadow to your light, and at the same time, work from a larger brush down to a small brush or a fine detail brush towards the end. And usually you can't go wrong if you work on those shadows, just as we've have been, laying down all of your fur patterns, your shadow details, decrease the size of the brush to a smaller brush, and then now work on your midtones. So pick a nice color right in the middle, block in some of those fur areas, and then end with a highlight with a very small detailer brush on top. You can't go wrong. And this would be basically a big giant rinse and repeat throughout the whole entire painting, that method. Dark to light and a large brush to a small brush, and you can really, really get some awesome fur textures using this method. So the next step in our paintings together, once your shadows and your midtones are dry and you're feeling good about the structure so far, we can go ahead and start to add in a highlight now. So you're going to take your base color of your midtone. So for example, mine was yellow, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and white together. And I've added in a lot more titanium white now. I'm taking my small filbert brush and I'm just slowly starting to block in the direction and thickness of this German Shepherd's forehead and sort of cheek area where the fur will lay and the direction that it is going. Something I would like to add in about highlights, which I think is very important as well, and something that I struggled with for a very long time, is making sure that when you're painting in your highlights, you are being selective of where you are putting them, and you are also leaving some of the shadow and the midtone to shine through. A lot of times, I know for me, I get very excited when I'm at this stage because I really start to see the portrait come to life, that highlighting everything feels fantastic. It feels amazing. You're like, this highlight here and a little highlight there. And before you know it, your whole entire painting is just highlighted. Now, it would be totally different if you had a very, very strongly lit reference where it had a big glaring light that the forehead and the front of this German Shepherd was very much so illuminated. However, if it's more of a natural lighting situation, you are going to have a more evenly distributed light source across the entire subject. So keep that in mind. As I'm working here, you can see that I'm being very selective. I'm following the direction of the hair that I put in using my filbert, but I'm only illuminating some of these areas with this really light highlight that I added even more white to. So at this point in the painting, honestly, it is a battle of patience and time and layering. What I like to do is once our base layers are dry, we've done our shadow layer, our highlight layer, and we're kind of working on our fine details. What I like to do at this point before I move on is to make sure that I revisit any areas that I think need to be tidied up a little bit before I can kind of continue on into another area of the painting. So you'll see me here kind of bounce back and forth between three different colors. I'm using my small round brush with my burnt umber, Mars black, and white together to do these sort of darker eye areas. So kind of putting in some of those darker flecks of hair in and around the eyes. I will have a really nice kind of peachy ivory tan middle tone color that if I feel an area has been darkened too much, I can put that back in, create another little sort of flick of hair here and there. And then I will also have my highlight color on the ready to go over top of anything that I think has gotten too dark. And you'll see that by even just me zooming out here, you can really start to see the clumps of hair forming, the area of the face as well. Remember, all of these animals have this muscular and sort of bone structure underneath this fur. And so, really getting all of the dents and dips and details in really do help create a nice, realistic portrait. And you can see I'm just going around with my small round brush, doing those little paint flicks, and again, just continuing to follow the direction that we set forth with our base layers and of course, utilizing my reference very, very heavily as a really helpful guide. A little side note about references as well. If you do not have a good portrait to work from. For example, I have done a lot of pet portraits where unfortunately the client has requested a memorial portrait. The animal is no longer alive. If you find yourself in this situation where your reference is not great, the thing that I recommend doing, and I have done in the past, is to look up references of that specific dog breed and try to match the reference as close as possible to something via Google Images, Unsplash, Pixabay, Wildlife References. They have an actual section for domestic animals. Look up some references of this dog breed and try to match it as best as you can. You can use it as a color guide. You can use it for a posing guide if needed, if some of the photographs are a little bit blurry. That's a really nice, helpful hint in case you find yourself in that situation and really struggling with finding a good reference to work from. So the next step in our painting, what I'd like to complete is the canvas left-hand side of this portrait. Now, this particular German Shepherd had really long, loose, kind of flowing hair towards the left. So the perfect brush for this technique would be the liner brush. Now, I have a various amount of brushes like this. Small and medium are typically my favorite, and they just create such a beautiful, long, flowing texture that honestly, the brush does all the work for you. So if you have a liner brush available, mix a combination of titanium white and yellow together and just use this liner brush and really get these long, beautiful flowing hairs. Now, the reason we're starting with a white base is very similar to the technique and the purpose behind the eye as well earlier in this painting is this yellow ochre is and burnt sienna color is very translucent. It doesn't go onto the canvas well. Every single brand that I've used, product, etc., has been the exact same. It does not stick well to the canvas and it is very, very thin. So by adding in this white layer, you can see here that this color really lays on quite nicely. We may lose some of the texture or the lines that we put in. You can see that they kind of disappear under this color, but we can always add them in afterwards. So don't be scared or don't be afraid if you notice that your fur texture is disappearing. This is specifically just for the color at this point, and we're just going to work on blending them together. And you can see that it combines the section that we've already painted and the canvas left of the face. So don't stress there. In my typical Cassie Draws fashion, while that left-hand side is drying, I'm just going in and I'm working on the right side eye now as well. It was bugging me that it wasn't completed and I just wanted to get it finished. So I'm adding in this white base, and probably why I used this and kind of went over to that area as well is because I had that white base already on my palette paper. I didn't want to waste it. So I've added in that sort of light ring underneath. That will be our glaze highlight, if you will. And then I've gone in over top with a darker color, burnt umber and Mars black, and blended in that shadow on the top part of the eye as well. So basically rinse and repeating the steps that we used on the left-hand side eye and doing that with the right side as well. So the next step in our painting together is to continue to work on the layers on the left-hand side of this canvas. So I'm taking that yellow ochre color and I've just added in some more burnt umber and a touch of Mars black. And you can see that I'm just being very selective with my small round brush and placing some of these darker shadows and just continuing to work on blending the ear section with the side of the face. Now, I'm using my small round brush. However, if you really like the feel of the liner brush, they would achieve the exact same look and feel. Just the hairs on the left-hand side would be a little bit longer if you use a liner brush versus kind of short sort of stockier hairs as well. So depending on the length of the ear hair in your reference, you may want to choose and kind of change that brush up accordingly, or use a little bit of both. That's typically my go-to. If one brush is not working on one given day, I'll use the other, or vice versa, totally up to you. But you can see here that I'm bouncing back and forth between that yellow ochre color. I'm adding in a shadow kind of in and around where the ear folds. So where these ears are rotating, they have a lot darker of a shadow. And then of course, coming in over top with my liner and small round brush and adding in a little bit of a highlight and a little bit thicker saturation of this color as well. So while we're letting those ear hairs dry, we can go ahead now and start to work on the interior of the ear. And it's very important to work from back to front. So before I do any more fur detail, I want to make sure that the interior of this ear is completed so that I'm not going back and forth, kind of using my time incorrectly by having to go over things over and over and over again. If I finish what is the furthest away from me and I start to layer on top of that, it just makes more sense, saves me a lot of time and a lot of paint as well. So I realized that this Barbie pink was a little bit too pink. So what I did was I added in some titanium white to it. And I just went around this entire sort of cavernous area of the ear and filled in all of the information that I could see. Now, a lot of this is going to get covered with the hair anyway, so don't get too caught up in making sure that it's perfect. But the areas that you can see, for example, where I'm using this color mixture now, I've added in some burnt sienna to it and a little bit of burnt umber. That area I can see, and it is the most cavernous area of the ear. I'm going to do some glazes to it later on, but for now, I did want to make sure that I had a slight color shift there and that it did start to look more rounded and more cavernous. All right, so while that area is drying, we can go ahead now and start working on some of the finer details in and around this area and kind of start to work on getting a really nice foundation for this ear. So I'm taking a burnt umber color, burnt sienna together, and a little bit of Mars black, and I'm just gonna go ahead and start filling in some of the details that I see. Now, if you're working alongside me and using this method of this sort of puzzle piece type way, it is very important to make sure that all of these areas blend together and that it looks quite seamless. So keep that in mind that you're going to want to extend some of these colors, just as I'm going to do here in a second, into the top of the head, into the forehead, down by where this ear is kind of folding and rotating. It's very important to make sure that they all blend together and looks very seamless. So we don't want someone looking at this portrait saying, oh, they totally worked on these areas in sections and it's very easy to see. So just keep that in mind as you're working through here. Now I'm using both my small round brush and my filbert interchangeably. Medium or small filbert will do. And I'm just slowly starting to block in these really dark areas of this ear. Now, this color is Mars black, burnt umber, and white together, sometimes a little bit of yellow or burnt sienna. But you can see that I'm really blending these together as they are both wet. And using wet on wet is a technique that I normally don't typically use. Normally, I am like specifically just trying to mix on my palette paper. However, this ear was really quite marbled. It was blending really quite nicely in the reference, so I wanted to make sure that I could get that look achieved in my painting as well. Keep in mind that we do also have our blender brushes. If you have a blender brush available and you would like to use that instead, you absolutely can to get this look achieved as well. Now I'm taking my small medium filbert and I'm just going in and I'm slowly starting to block in the areas that will have a lot of hair or that will have a different color over top. So there is some of this ochre color extending into the ear, and I wanted to make sure that I again had a really nice base for it to sort of be on so that it shines and shows very, very clearly. Looking at my reference, creating these color mixtures, blending them together, you can see that I added to the gray a burnt sienna color, and just following the direction that I see within the reference. So once you have a base down for this ear, we can go ahead now and start working on some of the fur texture that is on top of the areas that we've already completed. Now you can use whatever brush you prefer, but I chose for this particular German Shepherd portrait the liner brush. And the reason why is because this dog had a lot of different sort of angles and lines of hair, and a lot of them were really quite long. So for me, the liner brush was the answer. However, you could use a round brush as well. It would do the same effect, just a little bit shorter of a line. Or if you wanted to use a dagger brush as well, I don't usually use them in my work, but a lot of wildlife and pet portrait artists find that dagger brushes work as well to get really nice tapered lines. So whatever brush you decide, you're going to want to mix a color of titanium white, yellow, and a little bit of burnt umber together, something a little bit more on the eggshell side, not quite titanium white, just straight out of the tube. And we're going to follow all of the direction and the textures and lines that we see within this ear. Now, within this ear, there are two different sort of textures or variations of fur that we want to achieve. One is a much shorter hair that is seen kind of on the inside of the ear and on the left hand side. And then we also have the long, flowing, wispy hairs that are kind of towards the bottom, that are kind of covering this ear canal area. And so, for the short version of this hair, with this liner brush, I am loading up my brush bristles full of paint and I'm barely skating over this canvas with very light hand pressure. So I'm not pushing very hard at all, and I'm letting the very tip of this paintbrush do the work for me. Once I start working on the longer, wispier hairs, and this goes for fur in general, the wider and longer the stroke that you want, you're going to want to apply a lot more hand pressure. So you will see that I press down a lot harder and really fan out those brush bristles to achieve those long, wispy hairs. Now, because we've used titanium white, a little bit of yellow together, and some burnt umber, it's a very eggshell color. I didn't want it to be too white. So I'm just going over top with a glaze. This is probably a mixture, if I had to guess, of yellow and burnt umber together, very, very light. And I'm just going over top with a really wet brush and kind of glazing over top of these fur areas that I just painted. Of course, I waited with, of course, video editing magic. They were already dry, but please make sure you wait in order to glaze and not mix your colors together. You do have to make sure that it is dry. And you can see that I'm using all kinds of different colors to glaze over top of this area. So I've come in with that yellow and burnt umber mixture. And then for the center of the ear there, I knew it was a little bit too light. So I came in with some Mars Black as well and used a lot of water. And the trick with glazing is to make sure that, of course, you wait for your paint layers to dry, but also that it is not too opaque. You want to make sure that it is very translucent and that you are building these colors up layer by layer. And don't worry, I get this question a lot, but if you feel as though, like right now, this painting looks as though it is a little bit messy, I've covered over some of these fur techniques or textures that I've put down, and they kind of get a little muddled. You can, and I encourage you to go over top of this with a liner brush or a round brush and just go in and finalize some of these details a little bit further. So you can see that I'm taking my small round brush, I've dipped into some burnt sienna and some burnt umber, and I'm just going in and putting back these details or these little areas that need kind of a little bit of a tidy up back into the painting. So the trick with acrylic, any painting really, but especially with acrylic, is to really work those layers. You can see that I'm going in, I'm adding hair back, I'm glazing over top, I'm adding in some shadows, I'm adding in some highlights. So this is a game of layering and patience, really taking a look, taking a step back from your painting and realizing, okay, I've washed this area out a little bit too much with my glazing. I need to go back in over top and kind of tidy this up a little. So at this stage, we're kind of, I would say, three-quarters through the process of painting this ear, and we're working on the sort of final details now and making sure this ear looks exactly how we want it. So for my German Shepherd portrait, I realized there was a darker area towards the top that I needed to put in with my Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. But I also realized that the inside of the ear was just a little bit too visible and a little bit too pink. So if you ever find that you need to add a shadow to your work, whether it's the inside of the ear or you need to darken up an area, I really do recommend using Mars Black and burnt umber, watering it down for a glaze, and using your blender brush. It is the one thing that I have found to be very, very effective for creating this technique for your dog's ears, this pink marbled shadowed color. It's really, really effective. And so I just wanted to include that in there, that I really needed to darken this ear up. And that was a really, really great way to do so. So at this point, we've had multiple layers of different colors, our burnt sienna, our burnt umber, we've got our pink in there, we also have our sort of eggshell and our sort of shadow color. And the final step before we move on is to actually add in these finalized highlights. So I'm going in with my liner brush, my titanium white and my yellow together, and a little bit of burnt umber in some areas. And I'm just going in and finalizing the lightest areas that I can see on this ear. So the wispy hairs, the hairs that are on the edge connected to the side of the face, and then on the top of the ear as well. So moving on to the right-hand side of this painting now, I would like to get this second eye finished. So what we're going to do is we have our white base for our highlight color, and we are just going to glaze over top with this gorgeous burnt sienna and yellow color combination together. I'm using my small round brush. I've got it loaded full of water, and I'm just dunking into that paint for a really nice glaze. Now, depending on the lighting of your subject, this may be a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. It could be a totally different color. But just make sure that this highlight, especially if it is a translucent color, is really just glazed in there with multiple layers. When it is dry, we can go ahead and add the second catch light as well, which will really start to bring this portrait to life. Keep in mind our same technique from the first eye. We are going to use those same exact principles. We are going to take our titanium white, Mars black, and some phthalo blue together, and we are just going to go in with our small round brush and start to block in these highlights. Step by step and layer by layer, you're going to slowly increase this color by adding titanium white. You're going to increase the lightness of it, and you're going to layer and layer and layer until the very last layer on the top of these many different layers is titanium white just on its own. And usually this titanium white color by itself is a very, very spot highlight, just usually one dot to indicate the brightest light being reflected. Now, next, this right side of the face was neglected for far too long, and so I would like to get this completed now. So I'm taking my small round brush, which is my favorite, and I've made a color combination of burnt umber, Mars black, and white together. This is a very sort of, I would say, kind of cool gray color with a little bit of a brown undertone to it. And so I'm just going in as we did on the left-hand side and following the sort of shape and texture of this dog's face. And keep in mind with all of these markings, wherever you place these markings will indicate the anatomy and the structure of this dog's face. So we know that the German Shepherds have, most of them anyways, have these gorgeous sort of eyebrow markings that really indicate whether their eyes are raised, whether they're looking off to the side, looking down. So really make sure that you pay attention to where these markings are located and paint them in accordingly. So the next step for our painting is to continue working on building these layers. Now, you're probably sick of hearing me say, layer, layer some more, layer, guys. It's really true, especially with a dog that has a lot of color shifts. These layers are super important. So I'm just adding in some darker tones here on the right-hand side. I'm using my small round brush with a sort of dark ochre color. So it's yellow, burnt umber, and a little bit of white mixed together. And I'm just going around and I'm plotting in the areas that I see of these dark hairs. And keep in mind, you are going to want to blend these two areas together. So try to remember the color mixture that you used on the left-hand side and continue it on the right. Now, while that's drying, I'm just going ahead and doing some light highlights on the top of the forehead. Now, you can see there is a little dip. A lot of sort of bigger dog breeds. I don't have any small dogs, so maybe small dogs as well as certain breeds will have this little forehead dip on the top of their head. My chocolate Labrador has a huge one, and so I really wanted to make sure that I put in these really nice light highlights. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but when you are highlighting darker fur, you are going to want to add in some phthalo blue to that to make it look a lot more realistic. And so it's not just gray and white. With a little bit of blue, it looks like it is reflecting light more realistically, and it makes it look that the fur is really, really shiny and quite nice. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about it a little bit further when I start painting the muzzle, but anywhere there is darker fur, keep that in mind that adding blue just makes it pop that much more and makes it much more realistic. So the next step in our painting together is to now work on the highlights on the right-hand side of the face. So once you have your initial base layers down, you've got your shadows, they're looking the way that you want them to, and they match the left-hand side of the canvas as well. We're going to slowly start to work in the highlights. Now, these are going to be the most potent highlights that you can see, the strongest area of highlights on your reference. So I'm taking my liner brush and a color combination of titanium white and yellow together, just a touch, and I'm going in and I'm following the direction of the hair, the patterns that I can see, and blocking in a lot of these short, stocky hair markings on the face. Now keep in mind, just as we have done with the ear, the lighter that you press onto your canvas with the liner brush, the shorter the hair will be and the thinner it will be. The more that you press down onto the canvas will kind of fan those Brussels those brush bristles out and will make a much wider, longer stroke as well. So keep that in mind. And if you can't quite get the hang of the liner brush, it does take a little bit of time to get used to. Please make sure you use a round brush. Round brushes will do and achieve the exact same techniques, just will not get you the longest hair possible like a dagger or a liner brush will. So if you feel more comfortable changing to a round brush for the really short, stocky hairs, I definitely encourage you to do so. All right, so once your white highlights are dry and completed and you're happy with how they look, we can go ahead now and glaze the correct color over top. Now, I have mixed together a color of yellow and a little bit of some burnt umber together, a little touch of white, not a lot, and I've added in some water now. And I'm just going over top with a nice glaze and getting back this sort of yellow, kind of golden tan color onto this German Shepherd's face. Now, you can do this step in two ways. Either you mix this color and do the highlight already colored to your liking, or if you want to just focus on the hair direction and the thickness or thinness of these hairs, you can just use what I did, the technique of titanium white and glazing in the color over top. It will achieve the exact same look. It just depends on how much you want to mix your paint, and if you have a sort of hatred sometimes, like I do for color mixing, it kind of just saves you a lot of time and a lot of heartache. Now, once your glazing is dry, you can go ahead with a little bit of a lighter color. I've added titanium white to it, and I'm just going in and replacing some of these highlights over top of this glaze. So again, sometimes they get a little lost, sometimes they're just not bright enough. So I just go in over top and add in just a punch of highlights to this area and kind of tidy it up a little bit. And you'll see that I even extend some of this highlight into the forehead where this darker marking is with a lighter blue color. So again, a lot of this painting at this point is just fixing little minor details and kind of going back and forth between your shadows and your highlights. So the next step for our painting is to actually do a Mars black glaze over top of the area that we just completed. So I'm taking my small filbert and a really watered down Mars black paint, and I'm just going in over top of this muzzle area and blocking in some of the folds and the details that I can see. Now, this may feel counterproductive to all of the work that we just put in with our highlights, but I promise you that if the glaze is light enough, those sort of fur texture details will still shine through. They will just be a little bit darker and a little bit less noticeable. Now, again, as I've mentioned, you are going to go over top of this once your glaze is dry, as I'm doing now, with a highlight color over top and putting back some of those fur details on top of this shadow. You can see where I'm painting now, there was just a really nice fold kind of in the skin of this German Shepherd's nose that the only way I could think of rendering this correctly was to actually glaze it in. So this point in the painting, and even for myself doing the voiceover, it does feel very back and forth, but this will achieve a really nice, layered, realistic look to it. If it is only just a shadow, a midtone, and a highlight, your portrait may look a little bit flat. But by going back and forth multiple times through these different layers, you kind of achieve this sense of like this 3D effect. It looks as though the hair is actually layered and real and kind of sitting on the canvas. Now I'm going in with my small round and my liner brush with this Mars Black and Burnt Umber color, and I'm just going in and filling in some of the darkest areas that I can see over top of this glaze and this highlight. So obviously in this area that I'm painting, I had kind of missed this section and it got too light. So I'm just going in over top and kind of replacing that color back where it needs to be. And again, your German Shepherd may look very different. Maybe their whole sort of snout or muzzle is dark, whereas mine is a little bit more light. So you are going to tailor this to your needs and to your reference, of course. Totally may be different from mine, and just again, use that same method, but according to your own reference. So the next step in our painting together is to actually start to work on the mouth now of your subject. So what I'm doing is I'm taking Mars Black, Phthalo Blue, and white together with my small round brush, and I'm just doing these sort of short sweeping motions on the muzzle area of this shepherd. Now, The highlights on the mouth will be very selective. So, with your pet portraits, most subjects that I typically paint have what I call a smile. So, they're looking at their owner or whoever took the picture and they are smiling at them. Most of them have their tongue out, they're loving life. And so, they've got a lot of skin folds on their mouth that need to be put in and highlighted. And the edges of these skin folds are always going to usually reflect the most light. So you can see that I'm being very selective of where I put this color. And I'm just kind of slowly starting to layer and build the depiction that this skin has many different layers and it's kind of crumpled together and there's a lot of skin there. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video about highlighting darker fur. I also covered a video of this on YouTube as well. I painted a black Labrador named Kaylee, and I covered this sort of subject at length. But highlighting dark fur never usually uses just plain titanium white or gray. There is always going to be an undertone color that is kind of hidden within. So, for example, in this particular highlight for this portrait, I am mixing blue into my color mixture. And the reason being is because in my reference, I could see a slight blue reflection being reflected back to me from the camera. It was not just a gray tone. It had this beautiful sort of shiny blue highlight to it. Now, the highlight could change depending on your lighting. It could be a lighter brown highlight. Sometimes it's even purple, maybe a little bit of a darker navy color. This will all change depending on your reference. But when in doubt, when you are painting darker fur, I definitely say that adding phthalo blue is always a safe choice. I have done many subjects with darker fur, and it always really worked quite well. It works way better than just using black, gray, and white to depict a highlight. That tends to look more so like a monochromatic painting if you were to paint something entirely in black and white or take a picture and change it with a filter to black and white. That's typically what you would see. But in a colorful photo where there is a lot of different elements, daylight, what time of day is it? Where is it? Is it inside? Is it outside? Typically, that will really change your sort of lighting situation, but most color photos will always have a hidden tone within that highlight. I've been ranting about this, I'm sorry, but I think it's very important. And a lot of times I will see artists who maybe haven't had this experience yet with their subjects using a lot of just gray tones to highlight. So I just wanted to cover this at length. I think it's very important and just keep this in mind. And let me know in the comments of this video, whether it be on Ko-fi or YouTube, if it worked for you and how you felt about it. Now, once you have your highlights done and you're feeling good, you can slowly start to see those skin folds. I'm just taking my small round brush with a color combination of Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. It is much more on the sort of warm gray tone, and I'm just going in and starting to fill in the area just on top of the snout of this German Shepherd. So that is the area where the hair typically is kind of worn off or it doesn't have a lot of it. So I've just gone in and I've blocked in all of the little stubbly hairs that I could see, and I've even slowly started to extend some into the bottom of the muzzle as well. You will notice this a lot with dogs that are aged. A lot of dogs who are on the older side, when their pictures are taken, will have a lot of these sort of white little speckly salt and pepper type hairs as well. So keep that in mind. Or you may have a really nice front facing lit photo where I call them whisker holes. It is not scientific at all, but where their whisker holes are illuminated as well. And that's catching the most light. So I'm just slowly and building these layers up on this mouth area. And you can really see it start to come together and look much more realistic. So on my palette paper on the left, you can see that I have at least 6 to 7 color variations on the go that I'm dinking. I am dunking back into on occasion and changing this tone up for the different various areas of this mouth. So keep that in mind. If you find your paint dries as well, you can get a stay wet palette too, so you can have all these colors pre-mixed and use them as you go. So the next step in our portrait is to complete the canvas right-hand side of this ear now. So we're going to essentially rinse and repeat the steps that we used on the left-hand side and now just using them on the right to bring them both together. So I'm using my liner brush and my small round brush, and I'm just taking a color combination of titanium white and a little bit of yellow together, In times a little bit of burnt umber. It is a very, very light eggshell, and I'm just going ahead and blocking in the hair and the direction of the hair on this side of the canvas. Now you will see also that I switch over to a burnt umber, Mars black, and titanium white mixture as well. And the reason being is because the angle of this ear is different than the canvas left-hand side. So you can see here where I'm painting is the sort of side of the ear and not the interior. So I will have a few different color shifts than I did on the left-hand side. So the next step is actually to fill in a large block of color with this Mars Black, burnt umber, and white color combo together. So I'm using my small round brush and I'm just going in and I'm filling in this large block of color towards the top. Rather than kind of fussing around with my liner brush, it was just easier to bump up the size of my brush into the small round. And then I'm also going to use the same color combination but add more titanium white to it now. So Mars Black, burnt umber, and a lot more titanium white. And these will be the interior brown hairs that can be seen throughout my reference. And these are kind of almost like little shadowed hairs because this ear is kind of I believe it's concave sort of shape, if you will. So the interior are going to be a lot darker than the exterior that catches a lot of the light. So I've put those in. I'm going to do, again, rinse and repeat of our glazing steps on the left-hand side. Glaze that white color down a little bit to a sort of more yellow eggshell. And then, of course, bringing in this burnt sienna yellow color combination in a glaze to create this really nice, beautiful golden color around this ear. So something to keep in mind when you're painting the ears of your subject is to remember that although they are on the same animal, these ears may look very different. For example, with my portrait, the canvas left ear that we've completed so far is much more front facing than the one on the right. You can see that there is a shift where this canvas right ear is turned a different direction. So I am going to have to put in a lot more of these hairs, which I'm doing now, that are going to cover this pink area. It's just we're seeing this ear from a different angle. And there will be more color. There will be a little bit more of a shadow in the pink area as well. So just keep that in mind as you're painting your subject to really digest your reference and see, okay, yes, it's a 3/4 portrait, but where is that ear facing and what angle should I be painting it at? So keep that in mind. Right now, I'm just finalizing the details on this ear. We have gone from our shadow layers to our midtone, and now I'm just going in with my liner brush and my highlight eggshell color, titanium white and yellow together, and just going in and finalizing some of these really nice wispy these wispy hairs that can be seen on the bottom of the sort of ear portion, if you will, going into the face. So there's going to be two steps now in this portrait that we are going to complete finally, and the first one will be the nose. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my small and medium filbert brushes and I'm just going in with some Mars Black and some white together, and I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the base layers of this nose. Now I'm choosing a color that again is right in the middle. It is not too dark so that I lose where those nostril holes are, but it's not too light that I have to do a lot of shadow work to get it looking the way that I want. Now, keep in mind on a dog's nose as well, typically the top part of the nose is going to be much, much lighter. So in order to get this color in accurately, I have just added some more titanium white and probably stepped it up about 15 to 20% in lightness. And you're essentially going to be able to see, just as you can here, two separate segments on this nose, a top half and then the flat in front part that you can see that is much darker. Now, here's the part two that I was discussing a little bit earlier. While we're waiting for the nose to dry, we can go ahead and start working on some of the fur detail on the left-hand side of the face. And again, our entire goal with this painting is to connect all of these pieces together so that it looks seamless. I'm using my liner brush with titanium white and a touch of yellow together, and really just using my wrist and my hand to create these really nice, long, wispy hairs. On my reference, this German Shepherd had a lot of wispy hairs on the left, and it really transitioned nicely from a really short, stocky hair around the face to a much longer, sort of wavy one on these sides. So I'm just letting my brush do the work. I've kind of turned it on its side in some of the areas. You can see those really thick blocks of color or value, if you will. So I'm really kind of turning it on its side and just creating these really nice sort of preliminary base layers for this fur. Now, again, we're going to glaze it up. We're going to add some shadows, but for now, I just want you to worry about getting in the direction of the hair and the thickness of those clumps. So the next step in our portrait, once all of those layers have dried, we can go ahead and start working on finalizing the nose now. So I'm taking my small round brush and Mars Black straight out of the tube, and I'm just going in and I'm re-outlining the nostrils and the split in the nose as well as the edges on this German Shepherd portrait. And the reason being, just as we did with the eyes, is that we've used a lot of paint on this canvas. So I just wanted to tidy it up a little bit and kind of make sure that my details were correct. Once you have this outline completed, we can go ahead with our small round brush and start adding in some of the darker shadow detail now to the sort of middle and bottom area of this nose. So I'm going to fill in all of the areas that I can see that are this dark shadow color. And once I'm happy with how I have layered this, the next most important step, in my opinion, of painting a dog's nose is to really get that texture in. And so I get a lot of questions of how I do this, so I'm going to do my best to explain. But what I will do is I will load up my brush with my shadow color that I'm working with. And I will use a light stippling technique and just punch, honestly, sounds weird, but like I will punch in little tiny dots all along the top of this nose. If you really research dog noses, you will see that they have this really circular kind of spongy texture to them. And so by doing a stippling technique, I found that to be the best way to achieve the look that I was going for. And I will essentially do the stippling in the shadow, but then I will also come in with my small round brush with a much lighter highlight color of this gray and do the dots over top of them as well in select areas. And I think it's important to note, at least for my work, that I only do these dots in selective areas. I find that sometimes if you really paint in every single dot, if you were to draw every circle that you see, although it may look really, really realistic, I found that for me, it was just a little bit overwhelming and kind of distracting. So, in my particular style, I like to be a little bit more selective. Every artist will be different and want to paint differently, so keep that in mind. But at least for me, in the sake of this tutorial, I am just doing selective areas that I find the most important. So, the lightest lights, and then, of course, the darkest tones of these circles and spongy texture as well. So, I'm really just kind of doing the extremes, the really dark areas and then the really light on top. So, something to keep in mind as we are nearing the completion of our dog nose for this portrait is to also remember to add in the very slight highlights that you will see in and around the nostril area, and of course, the split in the middle. So, keep in mind that these dog noses are wet, and when we take a picture, if they're in a well lit area, a lot of this sunlight or the kind of wet nose will reflect light back to us. So, you can see that I'm adding in some really light highlights in and around the bottom of the nostrils, and then, of course, in the split and along the bottom as well, and then finalizing those highlights on the top of the nose. So, just very fine details to keep in mind that nearing completion, you're going to want to add those in and just bump up the realism even further. I'm going to add in a little bit of a highlight on the edge of this nose to create some dramatic rim lighting, but aside from that, this nose is pretty well done. I don't want to overdo it with these textures. I really just want this detail that I've put in to speak for itself. All right, so the next step of this painting is probably, in my opinion, one of the toughest to explain. There's a lot of information going on here, color changes, textures. So I'm going to do my best and hopefully you find this helpful. But essentially, to start the mouth and this process, I am working with my small filbert and my small round brush. Those will be the two that I kind of interchange throughout. And I'm just going to work on getting a base down for the gum area as well as the furry area underneath. I am using Mars Black, burnt umber, and white together. And for the base, it is much more burnt umber than it is black. So much on the brown side. And I've just gone ahead and filled in a base to work from to kind of give me a good idea. And then on top of that, we're going to slowly start to work on the sort of darker shadow areas on this gum line. The gum line is a good way to describe it, the gum line of this portrait. Now, if you look at your dog's mouth, whether you own one or the reference that you were painting from, you will notice that they are very slick. They have a really smooth texture, and a lot of times they are very much so marbled like the ears, but much more so. So this German Shepherd had a lot of pink kind of down towards the bottom, which we will get into, but a much more brown, dark tone on the side. So it was my duty as the artist to really try to get this as close as possible. But it is a difficult texture to nail. So if you are having troubles with this, please know you are not alone. This piece was very daunting for me in and around the mouth area. It is a lot going on. There is gums, teeth, sometimes fur, all of these things, the tongue that you have to keep in mind. So, again, don't be discouraged if you are having troubles with this part in the painting. Now, what I found helpful was I mixed this kind of light, it's not quite pink, but it was like a really kind of dusty pink brown color. So I took my burnt umber, Mars black, and white, but I added a little touch of red to it. So it is a little bit more on the pink side. And I just slowly started working in the areas that I could see that were glossy or had a color change. So you can see that I'm kind of dropping this color in on the top of the gum line and then actually bringing in a darker color, Mars black, underneath to separate it. And you can see by just, I've probably done what, 3 or 4 colors, I would say, but just in this subtle shift, you can really already start to see this gum line come into place. Now, I found it helpful for me, and you can see even here, I'm really looking at my reference. My hand keeps leaving, but I'm not painting anything. I'm really trying to digest this and get it right. What I found helpful, and hopefully I think I will in this video tutorial, is to go over the outlines, yes, of the teeth before I go ahead and start blocking in the color. And the reason being is because I wanted to get these shapes looking as close as possible before I commit to them and filling them in with the paint color that I needed. Again, a subtle color shift, adding a little bit more red to our mixture and a little bit of white to get this really sort of brown, gummy, pinkish, dusty rose color. And I'm just selectively putting that in anywhere that I see it. And if I do feel like there's a highlight or a very slick area, I'm using this as my highlight color watered down. So I have not touched any titanium white yet, just on its own. All of these colors are mixed in with a brown or a red. I have not committed to that level of the highlight yet. So at this point, you're not going to want to go too light. You're just really going back and forth and blocking in these details. And hopefully this voiceover has been helpful so far. This is a really tough area to discuss, and just hopefully you found it helpful. If there's anything that I can clarify, please let me know in the comments, either on this video or of course in our Ko-fi page or the Discord. Please let me know. This was really, really tough to talk about. Next, what I'm doing is I'm filling in the tongue of this piece, which I absolutely love this. I just have to put this out there. The pose of this piece was so cute. So I took red, titanium white together and just a little touch of burnt sienna just to give it a little bit more of a brown tone. And I filled in that entire space with my filbert brush, and I'm essentially waiting for it to dry. All right, moving on. Again, this piece I kind of bounced back and forth, especially in and around this area. I was just bouncing all over, so I apologize. But what we're doing is essentially rinse and repeating the fur technique that we used on the left-hand side of the face, and we're going to continue that down under the mouth. And the reason why I'm doing this now is that I know there are some really heavily shadowed areas under this mouth and some hairs that are actually going to overlap. So I want to make sure that I'm doing my layering properly. I'm working from back to front so that I don't have to keep going over the same details over and over. So I put in the texture of the hair using my liner brush, just really, really quite light, very fluffy. And then essentially waiting for that to dry, I added the exact same color to the teeth. So I'm adding in with my liner brush. You can use your round brush, whatever you prefer, but I'm just going in and adding this eggshell color while I had it mixed, saving some time, using my colors and my paints productively, but just going in and filling this in with the eggshell. Now, it's very important when you are painting a mouth, especially in an animal, and in humans as well. Our teeth are not perfectly titanium white. They have this eggshell sort of like yellow kind of more natural bone color. So just keep that in mind, that you're going to want to use a little bit on the yellow side, and then you can go in with your highlights and your shadows afterwards. Coming in with my small round brush, I have added in a lot more red to my brown mixture, so the burnt umber, red, and white together, and it is much more on the pink side. So I'm just adjusting these colors accordingly, putting in little bits here and there, and just honestly fumbling through this, working my way through, layering upon layering, and really just trying to get these subtle color changes to happen without looking like three different sections. I'm really working on trying to blend them together. So the next step in our painting, we are going to want to slowly start to add in some more of the mouth details now. So I'm taking red, white, and a little bit of Mars black together to create this sort of dusty rose color. And I'm just going to continue blocking in some of the details in the gum line and the front of the mouth. Now you can see that I'm being very selective, filling in between these teeth, and of course following the highlights or the shininess that I can see in my reference for the gums. Now, this essentially is indicating that this is wet and shiny, that when the photo was taken, the light is being reflected. So I'm being very careful to only increase this lightness by about 10 to 15% each time. So that's a nice gradual gradient and not just blobs of white paint being put onto the gum line. Now, the next step is to continue filling in the information on the teeth as well. So I've mixed this color of yellow, burnt umber, Mars black, and some white together to create this really kind of natural bone looking color. And so I'm using this very sparingly on the inside of the teeth, for example, the back molars that have this kind of really cavernous pit in them, if you will. And then on the sides of the teeth as well, that kind of butt up against each other on the gum line. So I'm using them very selectively, only putting in a quick brush stroke of these shadows. And then I'm going in and adding titanium white each time until I get to my highlight color, which will be very selective on either the tops or the front facing side of the tooth. So not a lot of highlights to be seen on these teeth. It is much more important, I find, to really get those shadows looking right, and then the highlight will naturally kind of fall into place with your base color. Now you can see here that I'm slowly starting to block in some more information for the tongue as well. So a good thing to keep in mind is if you were ever wanting to shade a pink range, normally what I will do is I will add in just a little bit of watered down Mars black. And this pink will eventually turn to that really nice dusty rose color, and then eventually slowly start to turn into a gray color as well. So keep that in mind. The more Mars black you add, that pink is going to change much more to a gray color. My best piece of advice for this part in the painting is to really watch your layering and to take your shadows very slowly, especially in this mouth area. We are working in such a small, fine space that it is very easy to go heavily handed into your Mars black and kind of cover over all of the hard work that we have done so far. So what I like to do is I like to just slightly dip my brush into Mars black and slowly start to darken this color by 10 to 15%. I am not using a lot of Mars black at all. And in some cases, I will use even less Mars black, but add in some burnt umber to make it a little bit more natural and on the brown side as well. So keep that in mind as you're working. You want to make sure you don't go too dark too soon and that you have a really nice gradient to this mouth and kind of this marbled texture of this sort of mouth skin area, if you will, the gummy part of the mouth. So next, I'm going to want to go ahead and add a little bit of highlights to the teeth and the tongue area as well. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to make a color combination of white and a little bit of yellow together. And I'm taking my small round brush and I'm just doing some select highlights on these teeth. I'm essentially just wanting to make sure and confirm before I move on that the shape of these teeth look exactly how I want them to, and that they have a really nice shift between the shadow and then the highlight. Using this paint pile, I basically just added in some red to it. So it's kind of this red, pinky, slightly orange color with some white. And I'm just going in and adding in some of the top highlights to this tongue. So you can see kind of on the underside where it's very veiny, I have kind of done some sweeping motions. And then on the top of the tongue in my reference was very heavily highlighted. So I was able to bring my sort of filbert brush in and do a large chunk of this highlight all at one time. So I'm just using this same single color and just continuing to block in this tongue and kind of reshape it a little bit. After doing the background, I wanted to make sure that it was nicely shaped. All right, so this next step in the painting, we are essentially going to be working in the neck and sort of bust area, the back of the German Shepherd, and kind of finalizing some details around the portrait. So I'm taking titanium white and yellow together with my liner brush, and I'm just going to finish the sort of neck area before I move on to anything else. So I'm just using my liner brush and just dragging down the canvas to create these really long, nice, wispy hairs. And I'm basically using them in a straight line. They were laying quite nicely in the reference, so no curveballs there in terms of direction, but just wanting to get these in so that before I glaze the area, I have these really nice fur textures and lines already put in and dried. Now you're going to want to slowly start to work on the sort of back and bust area of this German Shepherd as well. So I'm using Mars Black, Burnt Umber, and my filbert brush, and I'm just blocking in some of these base colors before I go in with any more fur details. Keep in mind, we're going to be working from back to light, just as we've done before. And so just like we did with the face and the ears and everything up until this point, we're going to do the same with the chest and the back area as well. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is as you're going, you will find areas that you need to improve on or change or alter. So you can see that I'm adding in a glaze of shadow over the tongue area and then, of course, underneath the chin as well. I didn't feel as though they got shadowed enough. And so this is a perfect example of me kind of revisiting an area that I had already painted and adding in some details on top. You can see that I obviously didn't think the tongue was textured enough. Those veins were not shining through. And so I'm just going in with a darker pink color, pretty much red and black together with a little bit of water. And I'm just adding in some of these vein elements that I didn't get in my first pass. And this is a perfect example of why acrylic is so amazing, that you can go in and actually fix something that you worked on hours ago or days ago and adjust it once your eyes have had a chance to kind of really digest what they're seeing. And so I've obviously revisited this part in the painting. I felt as though it didn't get enough love, and so I wanted to go back in and fix it. And keep in mind, you can use your filbert to glaze. You can use your small round like I'm doing for these really sort of small kind of pockets of details. That is entirely up to you, but I do encourage you to take a step back from your painting while you're working on it and really just take a moment and look at it. Don't look at your reference, just look at your painting and say, what is it missing? What areas need attention? And hopefully you will find that helpful in your own painting and maybe spot some of the areas that you missed. So to get started on the back and the chest portion of this painting, I am essentially using my small and medium filbert brushes interchangeably, and I'm just slowly starting to block in the details and the shadows that I see with a darker color. Now, on my reference, this German Shepherd had a gorgeous black back that gradiated or had a gradient to a gray towards the front and kind of faded out when it hit the chest area. So I'm just using Mars Black, Burnt Umber, and White together, and I'm just being very selective, adding in these sort of darker gray shadow areas to this chest. Now, it's something important to keep in mind as well, and I try to with my paintings, is that the main area of focus in any pet portrait is typically the subject's eyes, their noticeable markings, just their facial expressions, personality. So when you add in a bust or kind of like the shoulder area and down, I do like to make this a little bit less focused. So I try to paint it so that it is a little bit out of focus. It is not as heavily detailed. We can see now, looking at like a zoomed out version of this portrait, that we spent a lot of time on the face. It is very heavily detailed. There's a lot of color changes and shadows and highlights. And so with the chest, I like to take it a little bit with a thicker brush. I find that it tends to kind of just be a little bit more soft and just not as rendered so tightly and perfectly. So the next step, now that you have your base colors or markings down and blocked in, we can go ahead and add in a little bit of a finer detail using a liner brush. Now, I'm not adding too many of these, but because my reference had this really sort of sporadic gray coat towards the center and kind of on the top left of the chest, I did think it was important to add to match my reference and make sure that my client got a portrait that looked like their puppy, essentially. So I'm just taking my liner brush. I've mixed a color combination of burnt umber, Mars Black, and white together. And I'm just making sure that it's lighter than the other gray and Mars Black colors that I used before. So I do want these to be a little bit on the lighter side. So I'm going to add in some more titanium white and just be very selective and very sporadic where I add these in. And you can see that I'm only adding in a few every so often. I'm kind of just doing them in little tiny clumps grouped together, and then that's that. I'm still leaving a lot of that yellow ochre base color to shine through. I definitely wanted to make sure that it was mostly beige and tan in this area and just very selective gray. Now I will add in as well, once I am done doing the fine lines, I will add in a glaze to this as well. So I'm taking my filbert brush and I'm mixing Mars Black and burnt umber together with water. And I'm just going in and glazing the areas that have a sort of more heavily shadowed tone to them. So kind of under this neck area where their collar might sit, in the center of the chest where it maybe dips in a little bit, and then, of course, kind of underneath this chin area where the sun is not hitting it and the fur is much, much darker. So, again, these will be to taste depending on your reference. You may have a little bit more of a shadowed area than I do, but glazing this in really does help. And you can already see it kind of faded out and blended out those really fine lines that I did with my liner brush. It kind of blends them out, fades them out a little, and makes it look a lot softer, which is kind of the look that I'm going for. All right, and the last step in today's tutorial for this painting is to actually complete the highlights on the chest and the shoulder area. So I'm taking my liner brush. You can use your small round, your liner, your dagger brush, whatever you prefer. And I'm mixing titanium white and yellow together. And I'm just going in and I'm being very selective of where I put these highlights on this chest. Now I know that the light source for my reference is on the right. And so the right hand side of this German Shepherd is going to be much more well lit. And as it moves towards the left hand side, those highlights are going to fall off and become a lot more sporadic and sparse. So as I'm doing this, I am doing less brush strokes on the left, and I'm also being a lot softer with my brush grip or my brush pressure down onto the canvas. I want them to be the littlest, tiniest highlights on the left-hand side. And for the remainder of the portrait, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to revisit every section of your painting that you've completed and make sure that it looks the way that you want it to. So really pay attention to your shadows, your highlights. If you need to add some glazes in some areas that you may have missed, just go around your portrait and tidy up some of the areas that you think may need a little bit of some TLC. And then other than that, you're done. All right, and there you have it. There is the finished German Shepherd painting. I hope you guys enjoyed today's Ko-fi exclusive, and I just want to take a moment to say thank you so, so much for your support and for joining our Ko-fi community. I cannot believe that I am able to do this full time, and it is because of you that I am able. So thank you for your support, and please feel free to leave any feedback down in the comments below, whether it be on our Ko-fi page or on this video itself. I am always looking for feedback and how I can improve these tutorials for you, or maybe you have a suggestion for a future video. Don't be shy. Please put it down in the comments, and I will always do my best to get these covered and create as much as I can for you guys in terms of lessons and tutorials. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you in the next video.